listening to the Play Therapy Parenting Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, the Kid Counselor. This is the Play Therapy Parenting Podcast, where I give you insight, awareness, and enlightenment about your parenting and your relationship with your kids. In today's episode, we are going to talk about birth order, but with a little bit of a focus on only children, because first of all, I'm raising one, and second of all, there's a growing trend for 3-person families, and it is a very underrepresented birth order, in my opinion, because they're not as common as all the other birth orders. So if you do not have an only child, that's okay. Stick with me. Don't say, okay, I don't want to hear this episode, because I am going to talk through every single birth order role with you. And then I'll also spend a little bit of time talking about only kids. So the points that we'll talk through together today are, first of all, the universal norms of birth order. And if you're not familiar at all with birth order, don't worry, I'll unpack that a little bit together. And then secondly, what role reversals and hybrids and blends look like, because it's not always as cut and dry as the oldest child is exactly like this and the middle child is exactly like this. So we'll look at when those change and how they can be a little different than the standards. And then finally, the only children and that unique subset of the birth order population. So the path to calm, confident, and in control parenting starts now. All right, and before I dive in, I took last week off because of Thanksgiving, so I hope that each and every one of you had such an awesome Thanksgiving and time with your family and your friends and got to eat good food and make good memories together. So I am wishing you an awesome Thanksgiving week. We had a nice time. We spent 4 days out of town with my parents and did some fun things up there, and then shared Thanksgiving with a family friend I've known since I was 5 years old. So that was really awesome. My grandfather, who's 93, was there. So we had a good family Thanksgiving as well. And then on Saturday, we hosted Friendsgiving, which I don't know if you all know what that is, but you essentially invite a whole bunch of your friends over, I guess your chosen family, if you will, and you encourage them to bring leftovers from their Thanksgiving and or their favorite dish, but a lot of people bring leftovers. And then you just kind of have a second Thanksgiving meal, but it's with all your friends. So it's called Friendsgiving. So we did that at our house on Saturday and had some families over. And that was just a really sweet time of fellowship and being with the people that we've chosen to love. So anyway, happy Thanksgiving. Just wanted to get that out of the way. So back to birth order. So let me dive in a little bit to the background, because some of you are probably at least somewhat familiar with birth order. Some of you are maybe a little more extensively familiar, and then some of you probably have no idea anything about it. So Alfred Adler, who is, if you know anything about the theoretical models of the psychology field, different theorists, so the people that created this idea of the helping profession, Adler was one of those people. And so he lived in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And so you'll often hear Adlerian psychology or Adlerian principles. And so he happens to be the one who is credited with suggesting birth order influences personality. And he was Austrian and was a psychiatrist. So he had the medical background and the psychological background. And he kind of, I guess, investigated this a little bit and said, you know what, it's interesting that I think that the order in which you're born in your family influences who you are and your personality as a whole. So he argued that birth order leaves an indelible impression on people's style of life. And obviously that means the way that you deal with your friendship, your love, the people that you love, your work, all of those things. So Adler is kind of the earliest indicator of when this came onto the scene. And this would have been, like I said, early 1900s. And So he theorized this, and then there's been tons of research done since, and a lot of data that supports that this actually is true and it does influence. It's one of my favorite topics. I talk about it at my practice with families that come in all of the time, because when a family starts describing a child's personality, I can almost always pinpoint what birth order they are just because of what they're describing and the personalities, the characteristics, the traits, things like that. So let's look at briefly. Obviously, in a podcast, I can't give you an in-depth look at every birth order, but I'll hit some highlights for you. And so as we're going through these, I suspect you're going to say, oh my gosh, that sounds exactly like my oldest. That sounds exactly like my youngest. And that's why it's so fascinating to me. I've read lots of books on this. I've given workshops and presentations on this. I just think it's so fascinating how something that we have no control over and something that just is chance. I didn't choose to be a firstborn. I was just born first in my family. And my brother didn't choose to be a youngest either. So it's interesting how something over which we have no control influences us so heavily, even our entire lives. So the longevity of the impact of this is pretty amazing. So oldest kids. So firstborn, oldest tend to be very well organized. They like lists. So if you know list people in your life, you can usually predict they're probably an oldest child. Very much people pleasing, very driven, very critical of self, but then that also carries over to critical of others. And so there's a lot of self-imposed high expectations on the oldest child themselves, but then also that extends to being pretty high expectations for other people as well. And can you tell I'm speaking from experience? I'm a firstborn, so this totally resonates with me. Very self-sufficient though. Oldest are very independent, they are self-sufficient, they can handle things on their own, tend to be natural leaders, and this comes from being responsible for siblings. So what happens is the oldest are often told to watch your brother, or take care of your sister. Will you go get the bottle? Will you make sure that they don't fall? Hang with them for a minute while I go do whatever. And so from a very young age, oldists are expected to lead younger children. So that develops leadership. They tend to be bossy. My brother accused me of it my whole life, childhood, and tend to take life pretty seriously, tend to be pretty realistic in the way that they think, and perfectionistic, and they love details. So that's a very quick overview of oldest. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we will talk about the hybrids and the blends and the role reversals. And so sometimes children take on characteristics of more than one role. But if we are talking about the stereotypical oldest child description, that is what we just talked through together. So those are the traits of the quintessential oldest child personality. Okay, so middle children have a very interesting role in the family and there's kind of that taboo or that stigma or, that wives' tale that the middle children always get forgotten. So the oldest always get the attention because they're first, and the babies always get the attention because they're last, and the middle children get forgotten. And that's kind of an age-old joke that's made, that the middle children are always seeking attention because they get left out and forgotten about. But it also makes them peacemakers, because they've learned how to not only negotiate between warring siblings, but they've learned how to make people like them so that they get the attention that they crave so much. So they're definitely peacemakers. They are very social. They're driven to be extremely social because they often go unnoticed at home. So friends becomes their focus, and they crave and they thrive the social engagement that they are often missing at home. They are very independent, very competitive. And again, this is driven by, I want to make my own name. I want to have an identity independent of being lost in the fray of my older and younger siblings. So extremely competitive. They always want to win. They want to make a name for themselves with their victories. They tend to be a little rebellious, And often that is for negative attention's sake, but they also are used to kind of going under the radar. So it kind of gives them that push to do things a little bit more daring or bold than some of the other roles. They are also flexible and easygoing, though. So middle children, again, they're the peacemaker, and they are usually pretty laid back. They are very, very loyal because, again, when you kind of get forgotten and ignored, the people who truly care about you, you are fiercely loyal to them. And they tend to like to avoid conflict. They tend to be very diplomatic. That goes back to that peacemaking and easygoing. They can also be secretive, and that kind of ties back to that rebellious nature. They like to have things that are just for themselves. And so sometimes they don't want other people to know things because it's kind of an identity that they possess and no one else has. So those quintessential middle children would be described in those characteristics. And then youngest. So babies of the family. And I think it's important to note, and I'll expand on this a little bit more in the next point, but the baby of the family is always the baby. The oldest is always the oldest. And then there are different types of middle children. So you can have the middle of 3, you can have the middle of 4, you can have the middle of 5, add the number in. So a middle child of 3 is different than a middle child of 5 or any other number. So know that middle children are the ones that are the most flexible with their personalities, because if you have 5 children in the family, you technically have 3 middle children. So they all kind of find their own identity, but then they will also share some similar characteristics and traits as well. So just thought that was important to note as an additional thought. Okay, so youngest. Youngest are the babies. So they are the charmers. They have learned that they can manipulate, especially their siblings, but everyone as a whole, they can manipulate others to doing things for them. So they are the charming, they know exactly what to say and how to say it, and they can get what they want out of anybody. They are attention seekers. So they tend to be very attention driven, and that means often they become the entertainer. So youngest are usually very funny, very outgoing. They're very wired to get the attention and the things out of people that they want. So they tend to be carefree and fun-loving and funny, which makes them fun to be around. I mean, youngest are usually, kind of the life of the party people, but it also makes them complacent and unmotivated because they're so used to everyone doing everything for them. Think about, let's say, a family of 5. You're the baby. You have a mom and a dad. So you have 2 parents who are constantly catering to your needs. And then you have 2 older siblings that are usually also tasked with taking care of you and doing things for you. So a baby of a family of 5 has 4 people that will always do things for them. So they learn very quickly not only how to manipulate, be charming, but they also learn to be complacent and not motivated to do anything, because if they wait long enough or if they're charming enough, someone will do it for them. So unfortunately, it ends up that sometimes they don't seem to have a lot of ambition because they know that an oldest child will do what they didn't do for them. But they are very fun-loving. They're very creative. They tend to have that personality that's very magnetic and attracting to other people. They tend to be very affectionate as well, but they can often be needy because they need people to do things for them. They need people to support them. They need people to care about them. So it can make them a little bit needy in the grand scheme of relationships as well. So again, quintessential stereotypical youngest would have those traits. Okay, so I'm going to pause on the only children description because that we'll talk about in a moment anyway. So know that no matter how many children you will have at least an oldest or an only. So if you have children at all, you either have an oldest or an only. And then the more children you have, obviously the more birth roles you have in your family. And why I love studying birth order is one of my favorite books actually talks about how you parent based on your birth order, and therefore how it influences your parenting because of the way that you were raised in that role. So let me give an example of what that looks like. So an oldest child, parenting an oldest child is going to have a natural connection. They understand the expectations, they understand the personality, they understand the role in the family, they understand each other because they're both oldest. A youngest raising a youngest is going to understand that child as well. And so what happens sometimes is if a birth order parent does not have that birth order child, so a middle child raising only an oldest and a youngest, they only have two children, they don't have a middle child, so they don't really fully get either child because they've never experienced what the other is going through. So it's really fascinating. I mean, it influences who you marry. Oldest and youngest usually marry. There's combinations that are usually really conflict producing. So there's so much richness and depth in birth order. That's why I've studied it so extensively. That's why it's so fascinating to me. So it influences your spouse. It influences the way that you parent. It influences the friends that you're attracted to. And so, oldest typically don't attract each other in friendships. So two oldest are usually not friends because let's go back to the characteristics of oldest. They tend to be critical of self and others. They tend to be bossy. They tend to be a natural leader. So you put two natural leaders who are bossy and critical of others in a room, they're probably not going to like each other very much. So it influences so much of our lives. And that to me is why it's so worth diving into and figuring this out. So let's look at the expansion of this because we can fall into the oldest, the middle, and the youngest categories and say, yes, okay, I see that in my own children or in myself or in my siblings. I gave a workshop on this maybe 2 years ago now, and it was a room full of women, and I could just see it on their faces. They were thinking about their own siblings. They were thinking about their spouse. They were thinking about their own children. And you can just see those aha moments where people are just like, oh my gosh, it makes so much sense. And I use the analogy all the time that I am the only oldest in my family. So my mom, my dad, and my brother are all youngest. So the three of them will be the type who will, no matter how cold it is, no matter what the scenario is, they cannonball or jackknife or, jump in whole hog into a pool. And I'm the one over on the steps, like with just my toe in. And then I creep myself down into the water. And when I was younger, I always thought it was so weird. I mean, I just remember thinking, they're crazy. Why in the world do they just jump into the pool? My dad would mow the yard, be in his clothes, his yard work clothes, and would finish and be hot and sweaty and dirty. And so he would just cannonball himself into the pool in the backyard. And I was always like, he's wearing his clothes. What is he doing? And it was crazy to me until I started learning about birth order. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm the oldest. I'm the one that's a people pleaser, and I'm perfectionistic, and I'm responsible, and I'm too serious. So of course I'm not going to cannonball into a pool. But youngest are carefree and fun and attention seeking and charming. And so they think nothing of leaping into a pool. So it's a moment where you can understand the why behind behavior. And that's what I think is so powerful. So that said, let's look at the point number 2 of when we don't fit into standard categories. And what I mean by that is there is this phenomenon that happens, which is called a role reversal. And I don't want to spend too much time on it for time's sake, but if, for example, an oldest child does not take on the characteristics of a traditional firstborn, so if the oldest child is not well organized, is not people pleasing, is not driven, is not perfectionistic, if for whatever reason they end up acting more like a different role, then another sibling that comes along will adopt the firstborn traits. And that's called a role reversal. So maybe the youngest child acts like the oldest because the oldest acts like a youngest. And so we call that a role reversal. So that can happen. So if you were listening to me earlier thinking, oh my gosh, my brother's the oldest, but that does not describe my brother at all, there's a likelihood that there was a role reversal. So that can happen. I wanted to let you know that. Secondly, there are hybrids. And what that means is whenever there is 5 or more year gap in between two siblings, the birth order pseudo resets. So my husband and his brother are 7 years apart. So in that scenario, my husband is the baby because his brother is older, but they're 7 years apart. So my husband is actually an only and a youngest combined. And his brother is an oldest and only combined, because for much of their childhoods, they were only children. So those are called hybrids when there's a reason why you kind of take on characteristics of more than one role. And then there are blends. This happens most often in blended families, where you have step siblings, half siblings, families that are coming together that did not follow the natural pattern of birth order. So you may have 2 8-year-olds that end up living in the same home together because they're step siblings. And so how do we determine what birth order they would be? It becomes blended, and they kind of have their original birth order with their new birth order, and it all kind of settles based on the personality traits that children bring into the family when it's a collective join at the end type of scenario. So just know that there are, as I said, I can't get into the depth of birth order because it's really extensive, but there are lots of things that change traditional birth order roles, and I just wanted to throw a few of those out there for you. And then finally, let's move into only children. Now, why I bring this in, because I know many of you do not have only children, but here's what's fascinating to me. I just read recently, and I did not read the United States data, so I only have the Australian data. But in Australia, only children, families with only children, I should say, are now up to 14% of the population. And historically, it has been about 5% from what I remember. So as you can see, huge surge in number of only children families that they've documented in Australia. And I read that it is the fastest growing family unit. So more and more and more families are deciding to only have one child. And so I think that's fascinating because historically, only children have had a bad reputation for several things. Most often that they have no social skills, that they're bratty, and that they're very selfish because they've never had to share. None of which are true of my son, none of which are true of the only children that I know that live in other families. So I think there's been a stigma attached with only children, and there's always been this pervasive belief that they don't know how to interact well, and then they're very selfish, and that's just not true of my son and the other only children that I know. And so I think it's important to pay attention because this is such a growing thing. I can almost guarantee you know at least one only child. If you think of all the families you know and the people in your life, I can bet you know at least an only child. So who are they? What are they like? And, how do we make sure that we address them? Because they tend to be a forgotten face in the sea of discussion around children. So only children have been parentified. And what that means is they spend almost all of their time around adults. So most often they're parents. So the term parentification is when a child starts to think like an adult, talk like an adult, act like an adult, because that is who they spend the most time with. So they're often parentified, so they're usually more mature than their peers. They understand more than their peers. They're kind of ahead developmentally than children who are their same age that fall into another birth order. They tend to be very sensitive. They are also usually pretty mature, and that goes back to they spend most of their time around adults. They are also natural leaders. They're very dependable. They can be demanding, though. And when you have only ever had one child in the home, They've never had to share attention. They've never had to share resources. They've never had to wait their turn. They've never had to be patient while a parent addresses an issue with another child. So they can be demanding, and they have expectations of immediacy. But they are usually able to relate and communicate better to adults than peers for that reason. So, for example, my son is very comfortable around adults. He can sit down and talk with anyone. He has a very mature way of communicating. His vocabulary is very big, and he does tend to think and talk more like an adult than a child his age. And I often use the example when I'm meeting with parents at my center. Think about an only child that is 8, for example, and an 8-year-old in the only child's class who's the baby of 4. So an only child who's 8 is in a totally different stratosphere than the baby of 4 who is also 8, who maybe has a 10, a 12, and a 14-year-old sibling at home. So it differentiates them a little bit because maturity-wise and communication and comfort of being around older people definitely lends itself toward that only child experience, providing those situations. And so it's interesting. I just read an article. That's what actually sparked this whole podcast. I read an article that said only children are benefits to the children and the parents. And so I was curious as to what their rationale for that article was. And I'll hit some highlights for you. They basically said that only children are given full attention, and that allows them to really kind of figure out who they are and what matters to them. And, they've never had to compete. They are given full care, and that's financial care, emotional care, mental care, all of those. They also usually are exposed to grander life experiences than children in homes with multiple children. And I would actually, speaking just from a personal standpoint, I would say that's true. We've taken him on every cruise we've gone on. We've taken him snowboarding. We've taken him to baseball stadiums. We've taken him on trips. Everywhere we go, he goes with us. And I think often when you have multiple children, the cost is prohibitive. The logistics are prohibitive. And so often I feel that parents vacation differently when they have a big family. And they also choose different experiences just based on the practical nature of having a large family versus, one child involved. So they also mentioned in the article that they tend to be very close with their parents. And lifelong, they have a very close bond with their parents. And I think it's because they only ever spent time with parents when they were growing up. So that does develop a very close bond. And so that was what the spark of this entire podcast was just seeing that they're finally starting to come out and say that only children, there are benefits to it. And they're not talking about it in such a negative light. And I think that that's encouraging, especially since it's the fastest growing family unit. I think it's important for us to understand only children and what that looks like in society as a whole. And, every single birth order has incredible traits. So oldest bring a really cool thing to the table. So do middles, so do youngest. Onlys tend to be very similar to oldest, actually, but then they have some extra stuff thrown in. But, if you look at the special traits that each one of your children possess, I suspect that a lot of those are driven by their role in the family. And I think that that's an amazing thing to think about. You just so happen to have been born third, and so therefore it has shaped your personality. And as a related aside, we were in a store on vacation a while back, and there were these little desk plaques, and my husband found it and walked over to me and said, "You have to buy this and put it in your office." And it was all of the birth order rolls on different plaques. But the one that I bought obviously said oldest child, and then underneath it said, "I make the rules." And he's like, "You have to buy that. That's a talking piece in your office." Strangely enough, only one person has ever commented on it. And I think people just think that I'm snotty. But anyway, so it's sitting on my desk. And it's interesting because if you think about that, oldest child, I make the rules. I think the youngest child said, "Rules don't apply to me." And then the middle child, I think, said, I break the rules. And it's so funny how we just kind of fall into these expectations of, if you are this role, you're going to act in a certain way. And it all goes back to the early 1900s with Alfred Adler saying, gosh, the role you have in your family shapes your personality. So wanted to share that with you. I hope that it does a couple things for you. So yes, obviously, understanding the universal norms of birth order, it's the start, right? So now okay, youngest tend to be like this, middle children are like this, oldest are like this, onlys are like this. So that's the start. You also have to keep in mind, though, that there can be changes to those roles and understanding why those happen and what that looks like, especially only children. That's the growing role that is gaining some momentum worldwide. So with all of that, though, my goal is for you to have a better understanding and greater acceptance. And when I gave that workshop to those women a couple years back, that's what I left them with. I said, I hope that this gives you perspective on behavior that in the past might have been frustrating to you, annoying to you, confusing to you, friction-inducing. When you have a baby in the family that never wants to do anything, and that's the perception of another birth role. So an oldest might look at a baby and say, you're so lazy, you never do anything. That can be a criticism. But if you understand that babies are used to people doing things for them, and it's just their habit and it's their pattern, it's not particularly lazy. It's just, if I'm charming enough, I'll get my way and someone will do it for me. That is the why behind the behavior. And I say that all the time about children, right? And that's what we talk about a lot together, is if we understand the why. Why are they saying something like that? There's a feeling driving it. Why are they asking that question? There's something more there. So the why helps us accept what it is. And it doesn't make it any less strange when I watch my whole family jump into the river or the lake or the ocean or the pool or wherever we are with, abandon and freedom, and I'm still on the shore with just my toe in. That is still different. And I still go, oh my word, I don't understand why they do this. But it does not create division and it does not create frustration. And that's the power of understanding the birth order and how it shapes your personality. Because when you have the why, you can accept the behavior differently. So that's my hope for you. Maybe you have children that you just sometimes don't get their personality. You don't understand why they are the way they are. I hope that maybe birth order sheds light on that. Maybe your spouse, maybe your best friend, maybe your family members, if there's been that confusion and that frustration of we just don't see eye to eye, we just don't act the same way, I think that birth order gives us some explanation into that. And the goal is always finding the common ground. That's what we strive for in our parenting. That's what we strive for in our relationships. It's where can we connect with others? How can we better understand and better communicate and connect on a meaningful level? So that's my hope for this. I hope that you're able to walk away with that. Please send me emails, send me your thoughts, your comments, your questions. I'd love to hear from you. Brenna at thekidcounselor.com. Don't forget to go to playtherapyparenting.com. That's where all the podcast episodes are. And playtherapyparenting.com/newsletter is also where you can sign up for that. Just to let you know, in a future episode, I'm going to discuss, are schools pushing kids too far too fast? A little bit on the heels of our decision to homeschool, but just a result of an email that I got this week. And it got my wheels turning. And usually when my wheels turn, we end up doing a podcast together. So that's where we are. Are schools pushing kids too far too fast? We'll talk about that in a future episode. As always, thank you so much for being a part of the Play Therapy Parenting podcast family. And we'll talk again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more parenting training and to subscribe to our newsletter, go to www.thekidcounselor.com.